Joining us now, New York Times diplomatic correspondent Michael Crowley and Ned Price, former CIA and senior State Department official. All right, so Michael, give us the contours of this meeting. What are the expectations?
Well, I think that a big part of the question here is what is the U.S. proposal and plan? What are they going to be pushing here? And there's an indication that after that terrible meeting at the White House last week, the U.S. is actually asking more of Ukraine. So the pressure has just been steadily growing on Zelensky and the Ukrainians. U.S. officials have been saying in recent hours that they are now, really looking specifically to see what concessions Ukraine is willing to make in the name of peace. And it's really just, upside down from the days when my co-guest Ned here was representing the U.S. position. And, under the Biden administration, the question was that, peace is a possibility, but the Russians have to be willing to make concessions because they are the aggressors. They are the initiators. They occupy about a fifth of Ukrainian territory. And the question now that administration officials seem to be posing is, what is Ukraine willing to give up in the name of peace? And you have just heard nothing about sacrifices or concessions the Russians have to make. So, that's the early sign of where this is headed. And it will be interesting to see whether Ukraine actually does put anything like that on the table in this meeting.
And 2 points of leverage here. What did you make of Donald Trump last night saying on Air Force One that they're going to start intelligence sharing again with Kyiv? What do we know about the plans for that?
It's really confusing. I mean, Trump has been all over the map. There is a consistent through line here of being very tough on the Ukrainians, much tougher on the Ukrainians than on the Russians. But then every now and then he zigzags. So you saw, I believe it was on Friday, he issued a threat to potentially impose tough sanctions on Moscow, which seemed to kind of come from out of nowhere, and we've seen no follow-up on that. So, what is the meaning of this? It's not really clear. Maybe there's a little bit of an effort to use carrots and sticks at the same time, which, if you thought this was being played out rationally, could make some sense. But honestly, it has a kind of a random quality to it.
The other aspect, Michael, just to pick on you for one more question, is what Elon Musk posted on his social media the other day, that his Starlink system is the backbone of the Ukrainian army and their entire front line would collapse if he turned it off. How do you interpret that message?
Look, it's got to be incredibly ominous for the Ukrainians. I mean, it's a true statement, basically. The Ukrainians rely very heavily on Starlink. By the way, Ned may have had the same experience. I went into Ukraine with the Secretary of State. When you're on that long train from the Polish border to Kyiv, you connect to Starlink on your Wi-Fi, and actually the signal is amazing. There's no password. So, you really experience it. But, it has a little bit of the tone of, in the old mobster movies, this is a nice establishment you have here. It would be a shame if anything were to happen to it.
Yeah.
It's basically, that comes across as a threat. And I think that's how the Ukrainians are probably reading it.
Ned, give us the diplomatic side of things. What would it mean for the U.S. to push Zelensky to give up a portion of its territory to Vladimir Putin? That's what NBC is reporting is going to be pushed in this meeting, that Zelensky should give up some of the territory that Russia has been able to take.
Katie, taking that approach would be tantamount to saying to Ukraine, you need to surrender. You need to give up what you've been fighting for over the course of the past 3 years. If you take a step back and review the course of the past 3 years, Katie, look, we in the Biden administration, President Biden led the world in implementing a strategy to see Ukraine win. By strengthening its hand on the battlefield, that in turn would strengthen its hand at the negotiating table, which we all knew would have to eventually emerge. To be totally honest, I don't know what President Trump's strategy is. But if President Trump wanted to implement a strategy to see Ukraine lose, to see Ukraine surrender, as I just said, it would look a lot like this. And I say that because the Trump administration has just about systematically removed every single point of leverage that the Ukrainians had. Every single point of leverage the Biden administration provided them to see them win on the battlefield and ultimately at the negotiating table. We've talked about the security assistance. We've talked about the intelligence sharing. And by the way, Katie, it's probably no coincidence that Moscow has launched some 264 attacks on Ukraine since that intelligence sharing has been ceased. And perhaps worst of all, most detrimental of all to Ukraine, President Trump has pulled out the rug on the international unity. The fact that you had dozens upon dozens of countries providing security assistance, intelligence sharing, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, of course, not only supported Ukraine, but sent a very powerful message to President Putin that he couldn't win this, that he couldn't be waited out. That has now been removed. And unfortunately, Katie, Ukraine is in a much weaker position now. And my fear is that we'll see that play out ultimately at the negotiating table.
Gentlemen, hang on a second. We were able to connect with Keir Simmons, our chief international correspondent, who's joining us from Jeddah now. Keir, good to have you. I see night has fallen there. What can you tell us about this imminent meeting?
Well, President Zelensky is here. The Arabic channels here now reporting that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has arrived. So they do appear to be separate meetings with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. But it's possible, I suppose, that they could see each other, the President of Ukraine and America's top diplomat, here in Jeddah. That wouldn't be surprising given that they're in the same place. But ostensibly, what is supposed to be happening is that Zelensky is meeting with the Crown Prince, which I think you could describe as a kind of mediation meeting. And then Rubio is leading the US delegation meeting with the Ukrainians from tomorrow here. Now, I had heard of some of your conversation. I mean, this is going to be a really fraught few days of diplomatic talks. I suspect we won't hear very much about what is said with the Crown Prince. You might argue that that's the way it should have gone when President Zelensky met President Trump, I guess more than a week ago now, wasn't it? Because, you know, the conversation that happened in public exploded partly because it was in public. So I think we won't hear in that respect. But when it comes to the meeting between the Ukrainian officials and US officials, we very likely will. It's somewhat confusing what each side is trying to ask for and what they're going to demand. I don't think it's entirely clear what President Trump's final ambition is. I will say, and I was listening to your conversation on the battlefield, the Ukrainians have not been winning, and in Kursk, certainly the Russians are taking more territory. That's the area, of course, of Russia that the Ukrainians hold now some of. But here's an interesting aspect of that, Katie, is that the Russians, if they think they are taking back Kursk, may think that despite signalling that they want a ceasefire isn't in their interest right now, because why would you stop and negotiate over that territory if you think you're going to be able to get it back and be in a stronger position? There is a lot of cloak and dagger happening on all sides, but certainly on the Russian side.
Good context. Keir Simmons, Michael Crowley, Ned Price, gentlemen, thank you very much.